Mark Walsh here from the Embodiment Conference and Embodied Facilitator course. So I've been asked to do a video on trauma and people's response to the virus. So in this video, I'm going to look at how people who have been traumatized and cultures who have been traumatized. So shalom to my Israeli friends, здравствуйте to my Russian friends, both places I've worked a lot, how we respond differently in the space of threat. So this virus is a perceived threat. People that have had traumatic backgrounds can have a very different response to perceived threat, and some advantages, but a lot of potential disadvantages too. So in this video, I'll lay out what some of those are. So if you see them in yourself or in your cultural background playing out, you can have a bit of a better sense of that. So I have a traumatic background myself. I have a degree in psychology. I trained with a guy called Paul Linden, who's a trauma expert, and I've delivered trauma education for humanitarian aid organizations, police, military, all around the world, East Africa, West Africa, the Middle East, Afghanistan, slums of Brazil, etc., etc. So I've been, looking at this topic for a while, and what I've noticed is, first of all, in myself, in this kind of virus threat situation we found ourselves in, the first thing I noticed was I kind of liked it. Now, to be clear, I don't mean I wish anyone ill with it. I meant that there was a comfort for me. As someone that's been in very adverse situations and had a traumatic background, there was a sense of almost like ease. Okay, like, wow, the shit's hit the fan, but I'm ready for this. I'm able to handle this. Also a sense of familiarity. Like, there's a way in which trauma can wire people into that fight-flight response anyway. So a more permanent wiring of that fight, flight, or freeze response that may be a familiar term to people. That's one definition of trauma, actually. So when something external happens as a threat, it can almost be like, okay, great, I know what something's going on now. My wiring now matches this external situation. So for people who are relatively well healed, and I would count myself as one of those, this can actually be almost a positive thing. Like, right, I'm able to handle this. I'm used to stress in a way that most people aren't. I'm used to threat in a way that most people aren't. So there can be a sort of post-traumatic growth here. More commonly, however, is just a tipping into fight or flight much quicker. So let's take something like panic buying. Well, buying from fear, right? A common behavior we've seen when people clean out the supermarkets of toilet roll or hand sanitizer. If people are coming from a traumatic background, or it could be a background of oppression and scarcity, which is kind of a long-term trauma in itself, there may be a nearness to that fight or flight already. So people may be nearer to behaviors that may seem, I've seen a lot of judgment against people doing panic buying, and it's like, yeah, but if you were coming from a traumatic background or an oppressed background, there can be that sense of like your nervous system's more wired for those behaviors anyway. Okay. Similarly, we might see like over-boundaried behavior. So another thing you'll see in trauma survivors is over-boundaried, meaning defensiveness. So that could be on an individual level. Like a certain paranoia is certainly easy to kind of beyond the perhaps advised caution we might see, or even at a national level. That could look like xenophobia, racism, this kind of othering, this sort of them and us thing. You see this a lot in traumatized countries. You see this in Israel, for example. You see this in Russia. You see this in many of the kind of tribal environments I've worked in, a sense of them or us. I'm in a fight-flight mode, and there's a withdrawal of care. So withdrawal of care to me and maybe mine, as opposed to all of us. So this can lead to some of the more selfish behaviors we see, like the buying of, huge amounts of stuff, or just behaviors that might otherwise be atypical, like an increase in racism, an increase in unpleasant behavior towards others. So when people are defensive, they're not at their best. So this perceived threat, which is of course a real threat, can be perceived as much bigger by people from traumatized backgrounds or traumatized cultures where trauma's become a sort of shared norm. So we'll see this again in Israel and Russia, two places I've worked extensively. However, it applies to many other places, and also many sub-communities who may have, as I said, experienced depression, experienced poverty or other things. So for me, this helps kind of soften my response to when I see something that I might otherwise be judgmental of. Okay, so basically overreacting is what we see to perceived threat, because the threat is perceived as bigger. There's a wiring, just nervous system-wise, the adrenaline, the cortisol, there's much more close to the edge, much closer to go with that, which could lead to behaviors that are asocial, or that are, in the most extreme cases, even violent. It's not to say this is an excuse or that everyone who's had trauma does this, of course not. As I said, there can even be this post-traumatic growth where people are better able to handle these threat and stress, but certainly that ability. We might also see things like black and white thinking, where essentially the sort of smarter parts of your brain are being shut down, the neocortex, for example, and thinking becomes very primitive, almost childlike, and can be very like them and us, black and white, this way or that way. We may see that kind of behavior, you know, even up to a governmental level in some places, I won't name names, where that behavior comes in. It can lead to more authoritarian action. So it's kind of scary at the moment that governments can take a lot of power, and people are very willing to give power to authority when they're in a fight-flight response. So those out there in the world who would like totalitarian power, this is almost a sort of perfect environment for them to be in, where so many people are scared and they're like, please take my freedom, but just keep me safe. It's an almost childlike response. And again, in places that have had trauma, we'll see more of that appeal to authority, wanting authority to protect them, and authority figures actually getting more authoritarian as this kind of more primitive fight-flight response kicks in. So there's lots I could say. You know, scarcity, we've talked about before, I've talked about here before, but that can lead to some of the behaviors we've seen in terms of lack of generosity, in terms of hoarding, these kind of things. Boundaries I've talked about. It could be under-boundaried as well, which is people maybe not looking after themselves fully because they have a sense of learned helplessness. You may even see like danger-seeking behaviors from traumatized people. There's a way in which it can be, if you're numb from trauma, which is one of the main symptoms of trauma, is numbing, physical numbing, because it numbs emotionally too. You may see this thrill-seeking behavior, almost danger-seeking behavior in these kind of situations, and repetition compulsion, where people are actively seeking out danger in that way. Addictive behaviors associated with self-soothing and self-medication as well may well be on the rise in traumatized populations at a time like this, where it sort of pushes them over a bearable edge. Okay, so on trauma, I recommend Paul Linden, my own teacher, Peter Levine, Bezel van der Kolk. In terms of the stuff on oppression, Stacey Haynes and Ray Johnson. David Biselli has TRE exercises, which can be very good for sort of self-treating on your own at home if you can't get to or afford a professional. There's lots of good stuff out there like EMDR, other trauma treatments that exist. So we live in a time which is pushing traumatized people and cultures over a certain edge, and that may not be helpful. So I hope this information is useful and it spreads widely. Thank you.